May 8th, 1945. London erupts. Bonfires blaze in Trafalgar Square. Strangers embrace in the streets. Victory in Europe. The Empire has survived. Britain stood alone against Hitler and won. 4 months later, in September 1945, President Harry Truman picks up a pen in Washington and signs a single piece of paper. Lend Lease is terminated. Immediately. No transition period, no warning. Ships carrying wheat and machinery already halfway across the Atlantic bound for Liverpool receive new orders. Turn around. Britain, which had been surviving on American supplies for years, is cut off instantly. History calls this moment salvation. The ledger calls it something else. A hostile takeover. Over the next few minutes, you'll see exactly how America executed a 3-stage strip mining operation that transferred Britain's technological future, drained its gold reserves, and broke its currency. The bill for victory wasn't paid in blood alone. It was paid in patents, bullion, and decades of debt. To understand how this foreclosure worked, we need to go back to 1940, when Britain first opened the vault. September 1940. A British scientist named Henry Tizard steps off a ship in Washington carrying a small metal deed box. Inside that box are blueprints and prototypes that will define the next century, the cavity magnetron, jet engine designs, and Britain's nuclear research from the MAUD report. The Americans are skeptical. Britain is desperate, and desperate nations don't give away their best secrets unless they're truly out of options. Then Tizard opens the box and demonstrates the cavity magnetron. It's a device the size of a fist that generates powerful microwaves, enabling miniaturized radar that can fit inside an aircraft. The room goes silent. No one speaks, no one moves. The only sound is the faint hum of the prototype. The Americans lean forward, staring at the device. They realize what they're looking at: the future of air combat, submarine detection, and guided weapons. Britain has just handed them the keys to the 20th century. The trade-off is brutal in its simplicity. Britain invented radar, jet propulsion, and laid the groundwork for nuclear power. But invention means nothing without the factories to mass produce it. Britain's industrial base is being pounded by the Luftwaffe every night. American factories are untouched, running at full capacity and ready to turn blueprints into weapons. The cavity magnetron alone transforms the war. Within months, the radiation lab at MIT employs 4,000 scientists, producing half of all Allied radar systems using British designs. The technology enables the proximity fuse, a weapon so devastating it reduces the ammunition needed to shoot down an aircraft from 2,000 shells to just 85. Britain gets survival. America gets the technological foundation for post-war dominance. Every radar-guided missile, every commercial jet, every nuclear reactor built after 1945 traces its lineage back to that metal box Tizard carried across the Atlantic. The unspoken cost becomes clear only later. Britain invented the future, but couldn't afford to manufacture it. By the time the war ends, American companies hold the patents, run the production lines, and dominate the global markets for technologies Britain created. The Royal Air Force flies American-built jets. British ships use American-made radar. The empire that ruled a quarter of the world has become a customer of its own inventions. America didn't conquer the British Empire with armies. They acquired the intellectual property at a distress sale. Tizard's mission was framed as cooperation between allies. In reality, it was the opening bid in a liquidation process that would strip Britain of everything that made it a superpower. But technology was just the first asset transferred. The real bleeding was about to begin, and it would be measured not in blueprints, but in gold bars stacked in the holds of battleships crossing the Atlantic under threat of U-boat attack. The Tizard mission handed over Britain's technological future. Now came the turn of its financial present. America's neutrality laws were explicit. If Britain wanted weapons, food, or fuel, they had to pay up front in gold or dollars. No credit, no loans. The bill collectors in Washington demanded payment before a single crate left the New York docks. Britain had no choice. In 1940, the government launched Operation Fish, the largest movement of physical wealth in history. The entire national gold reserve was loaded onto battleships and fastliners, then shipped across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to vaults in Canada. Think about that for a moment. Britain took every gold bar back in its currency, the financial foundation of an empire that had dominated global trade for 2 centuries, and sent it across an ocean where German submarines were sinking ships every single day. One torpedo in the right place could have wiped out Britain's entire monetary system. The gold made it. Britain paid the American bill collectors, but by late 1940, the vault was empty. The liquid reserves were gone. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington had contracts sitting on desks they couldn't sign because the Treasury in London had no dollars left to honour them. That's when Henry Morgenthau Jr., the US Treasury Secretary, made his move. He demanded a full audit of every British asset worldwide, not just government holdings, every private investment, every share of stock, every factory owned by British citizens anywhere on the planet. Morgenthau wanted proof that Britain was completely, utterly broke before America would provide another cent of aid. The ultimatum was clear: prove you're destitute or Lend Lease dies in committee. The British negotiators tried to argue selling off long-term investments in the middle of a war would be a fire sale. They'd get pennies on the dollar. Stripping Britain of its overseas income would leave the country unable to feed its population or rebuild after the war ended. Morgenthau didn't care. His instructions from Roosevelt were explicit. Britain must scrape the bottom of the barrel first. The sacrificial lamb was the American Viscose Corporation, a British-owned industrial giant worth over $100 million. It was the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States, generating millions in annual dividends that flowed back to London. Morgenthau identified it as a target. He told the British they had to sell it. The cash from the sale would go straight to the US Treasury to pay for existing weapons orders. The British resisted, but Morgenthau held the leverage. Roosevelt was pushing a new program through Congress called Lend Lease. Instead of forcing Britain to pay cash up front for every crate of ammunition, America would lend the supplies and Britain would pay later. It sounded generous. It was Britain's only lifeline to survival, but the isolationists in Congress were fighting it hard, arguing that Britain was actually rich and trying to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed a sacrificial lamb to prove Britain was bleeding. The ultimatum was delivered cold: sell American viscose or Lend Lease dies in committee. On March 15, 1941, the British government seized the company from its owners and forced a sale. Picture the scene: British negotiators sitting across from American investment bankers who can smell desperation across the table. Everyone knows Britain has no choice. The bankers circle like wolves. They lowball, they wait, they watch the British squirm. The company sold for $54 million, roughly half its actual value. It wasn't a transaction, it was a mugging in a three-piece suit. Britain had to reimburse the original owners in pounds back in London, adding to internal debt, while the dollars flowed directly to Washington. It was a forced liquidation disguised as a transaction between allies. The pattern was now clear. Every deal with America was designed to transfer long-term British assets in exchange for short-term survival. Britain was trading its future income for present-day ammunition. But even this wasn't enough to satisfy American demands for strategic concessions. September 1945. Just weeks after the victory celebrations, Truman terminates Lend Lease with no transition period. Ships loaded with supplies are ordered to turn around mid-ocean. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's most brilliant economist, is dying from heart disease. But he travels to Washington anyway to make one final plea. His case is moral, not financial. Britain fought alone for 2 years while America stayed neutral. Britain sacrificed its economy to save Western civilization. Surely that earns consideration beyond cold accounting. The American negotiators are unmoved. The war is over. The American public is tired of paying for Europe, and the new Labour government in Britain has just nationalised industries and embraced socialism. Why should American capitalist tax dollars fund a British socialist experiment? The American response is delivered without sentiment. No gift, no grant, only a loan, with interest and conditions. The loan is $3.75 billion, barely enough for Britain to survive the next few years. But attached to it is Article 7, a poison pill designed to break the sterling area trading bloc that had protected British industry for decades. The demand is simple. Within 1 year, make the pound sterling fully convertible to dollars. Here's what that means in third-grade terms. Imagine Britain is a store where people can only use British coupons. For years, countries like India, Australia, and Egypt have been forced to hold pounds because they can't exchange them for anything else. This creates a closed loop. If you have pounds, you must buy British goods. The US forces the store to let everyone trade their coupons for American dollars. Everyone knows the American store has better products, better prices, better everything. So the moment the window opens, they all rush to convert at once. July 15th, 1947, convertibility begins. The run on the pound is immediate and catastrophic. This is the coldest winter in living memory. Blizzards bury the country in snow. Coal stockpiles freeze. Power stations shut down. Factories close. People shiver in unheated homes, lighting candles because there's no electricity. And in this frozen, dark atmosphere, the financial massacre begins. Countries holding sterling reserves dump them to acquire dollars. The money from the American loan, which was supposed to last for years, begins to evaporate. In just 1 month, Britain loses hundreds of millions of dollars. The hemorrhage is so violent that government officials watch in horror as their reserves vanish. August 20th, 1947. After just 5 weeks, Britain is forced to suspend convertibility in total humiliation. They burn through a huge portion of the loan for nothing. The motive was never about free trade. It was about destroying the sterling area and forcing the world to use dollars exclusively. Britain's empire had been held together by a currency bloc that gave London financial leverage over a quarter of the globe. The US just smashed it. The geopolitical consequences arrive immediately. In February 1947, Britain sends a telegram to Washington, admitting it can no longer afford to defend Greece and Turkey against communist expansion. The Truman Doctrine is born. America steps in to fill the vacuum. This is the moment Britain formally stops being a superpower. The empire that defeated Napoleon, that ruled the seas for 2 centuries, is now asking permission from Washington before making strategic decisions. The currency collapse continues. In 1949, the pound is devalued 30%, from $4.03 to $2.80. In 1967, another 14% cut. By 1976, Britain is begging the IMF for a bailout, with harsh austerity conditions attached. The empire didn't fall because of moral awakening. It fell because the money ran out. December 29th, 2006. Britain makes the final payment on the 1946 loan, 60 years of annual checks to the US Treasury for the privilege of surviving World War II. Think about that timeline. 60 years after the victory parades, 60 years after Churchill's speeches about standing alone, the British taxpayer was still paying for the right to have done the morally correct thing. Britain won the war. It defeated Hitler. It saved Western civilization from fascism. And the reward for that moral victory was bankruptcy, currency collapse, and the forced liquidation of an empire. When Winston Churchill wrote that desperate letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved his country from Hitler, but he also signed the deed of sale. Britain traded the empire for survival. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no other choice. But the cost was the future. Britain emerged from the war as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. It had spent its inheritance to buy freedom for Europe. Noble? Absolutely. But in the cold ledger of economics, it was a liquidation. The empire didn't fall because of independence movements or moral awakening. It fell because the money ran out, and the nation that financed Britain's survival became the empire's successor. Subscribe to understand the economic forces that actually shape history.